Welcome to this explainer. When we think of ancient Greece, we almost always picture this serene, golden age of intellectual brilliance. We picture the era that brought us the unmatched minds of Plato and Aristotle, but here is the absolute deepest irony of human history. That incredible intellectual explosion, it was actually born right out of Greece's most disastrous, exhausting era of political chaos and violent stalemate. Okay, let's dive into exactly how this collision of philosophy and conquest happened. We've got a roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the Greek power vacuum. Second, minds out of chaos. Third, the rise of Macedonia. Fourth, Alexander conquers the world. And finally, to the edge and back. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. The Greek power vacuum and the decades of stalemate. To really understand this era, we have to look at the fallout of the Peloponnesian War, because it absolutely did not bring peace. Instead, for 50 years, prominent city-states like Sparta, Thebes, and Athens just constantly squabbled and fought. They were all desperately vying for that top spot, but in the end, they achieved absolutely nothing except bleeding each other dry.
We're talking about an exhausting, endless carousel of shifting alliances. The Corinthian War kicks things off in 395 BC, which leads directly to Sparta doing the unthinkable and literally selling out Greek freedom to Persia just 9 years later. Then, power slips away again when a resurgent Thebes unexpectedly crushes the supposedly invincible Spartan army at Leuctra. The chaos got so completely out of hand that former mortal enemies, Sparta and Athens, actually teamed up against Thebes at Mantinea. Ultimately, the entire Athenian naval alliance just dissolved into civil war. Nobody could hold on to power.
The historian Xenophon really hit the nail on the head here. He basically noted that everyone thought the winners of these battles would rule and the losers would obey, but instead, they just got more confusion. It's a classic, tragic historical trap, right? While they were so busy destroying each other from the inside, they left the front door wide open for an outside force. So, moving on to part 2, minds out of the chaos and the search for order. How did brilliant thinkers react to this spectacular political failure? Well, they retreated into the mind, desperately trying to define order, justice, and what an ideal society should look like to fix a profoundly broken world.
The most famous Greek to come out of these decades of turmoil was Plato. As a young man from the social elite, he was fully geared up for a life in politics. But then, he watched his teacher Socrates get executed in 399 BC, and he was just utterly horrified. This trauma caused Plato to reject Athenian democracy entirely. He didn't just dislike it, he literally called it the worst form of rule under law. Instead, in his famous dialogue, The Republic, he argued that only a utopian society ruled by highly educated philosopher kings could actually succeed.
But it gets really interesting when you contrast Plato with his most brilliant student, Aristotle. It's like two sides of a coin. While Plato is looking way up into the heavens for these abstract, invisible forms like pure justice and beauty in some higher realm, Aristotle is looking right down at the dirt. He grounded his philosophy in meticulous, real-world empirical observation. Aristotle believed everything had a natural, practical goal. So in ethics, instead of chasing invisible perfection, Aristotle was all about common sense and self-control, finding the mean or the balance between extremes in everyday practical life.
Now, not all thinkers stayed purely in the realm of philosophy. Take the orator as Socrates. He basically said, look, sitting around thinking about philosophy isn't fixing the friction and poverty tearing Greece apart. So he proposed a radical, incredibly practical remedy called Panhellenism. He believed the only way to achieve real political harmony was to force the fractured Greek states to unite through a shared, glorious crusade against the massive Persian Empire. And the kicker? He said it should be led not by a Greek, but by an outsider.
Which brings us to part 3, the rise of Macedonia, a new power in the north. Because that outsider Isocrates was dreaming of, he was waiting right in the wings. Macedonia was this rough, mountainous land to the north of Greece, full of heavy drinking, fighting barons. But under the leadership of King Philip II, they were about to step up and brutally fill that Greek power vacuum. The crazy part is, the southern Greeks literally didn't see the threat coming at all. Listen to this absolutely biting insult from the Athenian orator Demosthenes. He calls Philip a pestilence from a place where you can't even buy a decent slave. It's just a staggering display of blinding arrogance. They genuinely thought the Macedonians were just backward and soft. Oh, they were about to find out how wrong they were.
So, Philip II takes over this kingdom in crisis at just 22 years old. And what does he do? He immediately transforms his army into an absolute, unstoppable machine. He drilled his infantry to fight in a tight, highly disciplined phalanx formation, bristling like a lethal porcupine. And crucially, he started using his cavalry not just for transport, but as an elite high-speed flanking strike force to completely crush the enemy's lines.
And a massive part of that military revolution comes down to the number 14, 14 feet. That is the length of the terrifying new thrusting spears Philip equipped his troops with. They were so heavy they required 2 hands to hold, which created this impenetrable wall of spikes that completely rewrote the brutal, bloody reality of ancient infantry warfare.
The results of all this preparation were just devastating. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip II and this new army absolutely steamrolled a coalition of southern Greek states. He forced the defeated Greeks into an alliance called the League of Corinth. And why is this such a big deal? Because in literally one single afternoon, the era of the independent, democratic Greek city-state, the system that had defined the Mediterranean for centuries, was permanently wiped off the map.
But Philip doesn't even get to enjoy it. He's assassinated in 336 BC. So we move to part 4. Alexander conquers the world. Philip's 20-year-old son, Alexander, seizes the throne, ruthlessly liquidates his rivals, and prepares to completely astonish the globe.
Now, when Philip died, some of these Greek city-states thought, hey, a 20-year-old kid, easy mark, let's rebel. Big mistake. Alexander marched straight south and secured his title as hegemon of Greece through sheer, unadulterated terror. He didn't just defeat the rebellious city of Thebes, he burned it to the ground. He made it violently, crystal clear that while he claimed to rule by consent, his authority rested 100% on superior force and his complete willingness to use it.
With Greece terrified into staying quiet, Alexander launches this lightning-fast, systematic dismantling of the massive Persian Empire. He crosses into Anatolia in 334 BC. Just a year later, he routs the Persian king Darius at Issus with a completely insane cavalry charge. He doesn't stop. He breaches the impenetrable island fortress of Tyre in this brutal, drawn-out siege, sweeps down to take Egypt, founds Alexandria, and ultimately crushes the last real Persian army at Gaugamela. In just 3 short years, he proclaims himself King of Asia.
So how on earth does one guy achieve all of this in just a few years? Well, Alexander meticulously constructed this heroic, borderline megalomaniacal image of himself. He modeled his entire life on Achilles from Homer's Iliad. Seriously, he literally slept with a copy of the Iliad and a dagger under his pillow. He led his troops from the absolute front lines, plunging straight into enemy ranks in brightly polished armor, with a reckless disregard for his own safety. And his men? They were so inspired they pushed beyond the borders of known civilization for him.
Which leads us to our final act, part 5, to the edge and back and the limits of conquest. Because, as it turns out, there really is a limit to how far human beings can be pushed. Alexander drove his utterly exhausted army into the unknown edges of the earth, basically searching for the end of the world.
Those final years were just a grueling nightmare descent into total exhaustion. He's fighting these nasty, brutal guerrilla wars out in the harsh steppes of Bactria before finally hitting India in 326 BC. His ultimate ambition? He wanted to march all the way to China. But after 70 straight days of monsoon rains, his men just broke. At the Hyphaeus River, this unstoppable Macedonian army finally mutinied. Alexander was furious, but he had to turn back. He led them on a hellish return journey through the Gedrosian desert, and eventually he dies in Babylon in 323 BC.
And to really understand how horrific that return journey was, just wrap your head around the number 127. That was the temperature, in degrees Fahrenheit, in the shade. Countless soldiers and camp followers died from the heat and thirst out in the Gedrosian desert. There's this legendary moment where his soldiers found a tiny bit of water, brought it to Alexander in a helmet, and he just poured it straight out onto the burning sand, refusing to drink even a drop if his men couldn't. By the time he finally dragged himself back to Persia, Alexander's legacy was set. Having conquered the known world, he actually sent decrees back to the Greek city-states, demanding to be recognized as a living god. And, out of sheer terror, they agreed. But his true, lasting legacy was cultural. His violent conquests forever forced the Greek and Near Eastern worlds into direct, permanent contact, birthing the massive, blended Hellenistic civilization that would shape the region for centuries to come. But this whole incredible saga leaves us with one massive, critically important question. What happens when the hegemon, the supposedly living god who's holding the entire known world together through sheer force of will and terror, suddenly dies of a fever at age 32, and with no mature heir to take over?
Well, as he was dying, his top commanders leaned in and frantically asked who he was leaving this unbelievable vast empire to. Alexander just gasped out a chilling reply, "To the most powerful." And with those 4 tiny, provocative words, he threw his entire empire right back into the exact same chaotic, bloody nightmare the Greeks had just spent 50 years trying to escape. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a striking new perspective on how our classical world was actually forged right out of the chaos.